Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. With me is Professor Pant. This week, we are discussing a couple of important things, beginning with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Bangladesh. It's very significant looking at the timing, and also very significant is the fact that Bangladesh is celebrating the birth centenary of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. With it, of course, 50 years of diplomatic relationship with India and 50 years of Bangladesh's war of liberation. So we will look at how significant is Prime Minister Modi's visit, his first visit in these COVID times actually out of the country. Another very interesting thing that has happened is India abstaining from voting on the Sri Lankan issue at the UNHRC, and that's also generating a mixed response. Along with that, the Western sanctions against China, because of the atrocities that China has been going on with in the Xinjiang area. But now with these restrictions or the sanctions, China is reiterating with, that it is whatever it is doing there is all right. And the Western nations, by imposing sanctions, are actually making a mistake. So we will look at all these and, of course, Israeli elections. But let us begin with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Bangladesh, Harsh. Now that we know that the two leaders have had a virtual summit in December 2020, there has been an inauguration of a rail link and also the Maitri Bridge. So connectivity has increased. It's very important because India and Bangladesh mark 50 years of diplomatic relationship. Now, it is the first foreign visit amid COVID-19. Is this definitely a policy signal, and it is signaling a firm support to Sheikh Hasina government. So how significant is the timing, and what do we expect? India-Bangladesh relationship has been on an upswing, we know. We will also look at India's domestic compulsions later, but let's look at what are we expecting of this visit and its timing.
Well, I think, in some ways, Naghma, this visit is primarily about the symbolism of the relationship and how historically deep-rooted the relationship has been. And given what we are celebrating this year, both in terms of, Bangladesh's ties with India, as well as Bangladesh's evolution as an independent nation state, I think Indian Prime Minister had to go to these celebrations. But what I think the attempt here is to signal how important Bangladesh has become now for Indian foreign policy, for Indian foreign policy priorities. And you also see how much investment I think Prime Minister Modi himself has made in this relationship. I think if you take a look at the region, you would see that the kind of top-level engagement that the Prime Minister of India has had with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, it's very rare to see happening in other cases. I think there has been a real commitment from the side of Mr. Modi, and reciprocally, we have seen how Prime Minister Hasina has been very, very important for Indian interests and has been very warm and welcoming of India as a partner. Even the statements that have been made out during the visit, it's very clear that both sides recognize the importance of each other, but also both sides recognize the challenges. Prime Minister Modi himself mentioned that the challenges are there, but they can be overcome. So I think what Prime Minister seems to be doing during his visit is signaling to Bangladesh that as India makes Bay of Bengal the focus of its foreign policy priorities, as India emerges as an Indo-Pacific power, rejuvenated engagement with Bangladesh is going to be at the core of it. We really cannot do much without Bangladesh being on our side, and that's what the signal is all about. At a time when Bangladesh itself is becoming such an important economic player, with its transformation in its economic profile, the way it is rising, its per capita GDP now very, very high, and I think India and Bangladesh together becoming the engines for growth in the region. If South Asia has to come out of the economic deceleration, if it has to emerge as the engine of growth in the region, India and Bangladesh ties are going to be critical to that. And I think that's what the signaling is all about. That's what the symbolism of this visit is all about, that while the relationship is rooted in history, it is also about today. It is also about tomorrow. And the youth factor that Prime Minister talked about during his visit, I think a lot of his remarks have been focused on bringing Indian youth and Bangladeshi youth together, giving Bangladeshi youth a stake in India's startup and innovation sector. And I think those are all very important to signal that 21st century requirements of the relationship will have to be acknowledged, and they will have to be taken forward. So I think all in all, you look at an entire gamut of this relationship today emerging in a very substantive manner, and hopefully this will take this relationship to the next stage, where what we are celebrating right now is, of course, Bangladesh's liberation, but it also means that as Bangladesh and India look towards the future, there are other areas to be explored, and the relationship has to be taken in a new direction. And that's what perhaps this visit has been able to underscore and underline.
Yes, Bangladesh's growth story has been very impressive. Also, it has a very privileged position in India's foreign policy matrix. But Harsh, how does one factor in Assam and the elections there in India-Bangladesh relationship, and how is India's domestic political dynamics and also the necessities of the bordering states like Assam, affect India's policies with Bangladesh?
I think they do affect, because in a sense, our ties with our neighbors are such that we are implicated in the domestic political landscape one way or the other. And I think anything that India does in its domestic politics, when it is concerned with the bordering states, has an impact. Whether you look at Sri Lanka's case in Tamil Nadu, whether you look at Assam and Bengal and Bangladesh, I think that will have an impact on the discourse, on the way people look at India. What I think has been very interesting and important is a certain maturity that has come into the relationship. That there will always be constituencies in India, there will be constituencies in Bangladesh that would be, that would try to derail the relationship, or that would make it seem as if this is one particular aspect, be it about CA and NRC, or be it about extremism in Bangladesh, are the center point of the relationship. But what we are witnessing now is a maturity in both sides to understand that they are important and they need to be addressed, but they're not central. They're not at the core of the relationship. A very interesting statement coming out from the National Security Advisor of Bangladesh, saying that, look, there are certain issues that are primarily about India's domestic politics, India's domestic concerns. We don't want to intervene. It is for Indian democracy to settle those issues. But we would like to see a greater acknowledgement of our concerns, and that's what India would also say when India, when at times India is raised or India is made, as we witnessed during Prime Minister's visit. Also, there were protests and demonstrations by certain hardline groups in Bangladesh. But I think that is to be expected in two democracies that are coming to terms with each other. What is important is whether the top leadership, whether the bureaucracies on the two sides are able to navigate them effectively and able to map out a roadmap for the future. And I think that's what perhaps the two leaderships in both Dhaka and Delhi, as well as the two bureaucracies, the foreign policy bureaucracies in two countries, seem willing to do right now. So I think that therefore a lot of the concerns that we used to have in the past have been put aside now, including, by the way, Teesta water dispute. Now, it's a very significant problem, and both Bangladesh would like it to be resolved, but they also know that it is not simply in the hands of central government to do it. There has to be certain coordination between state and center. In this case, West Bengal government. So clearly, I think the implication is that Bangladesh now better understands India's concerns. India understands where Bangladesh is coming from when they talk about Teesta, and I think that's why the center government. I think even during Manmohan Singh's time, we have been looking at a concerted effort to resolve this problem. And of course, those that could be resolved, maritime dispute, land boundary agreement, have been resolved. So it is also an interesting case in India-Bangladesh relations that India has gone out of the way to assuage Bangladesh's concerns. In fact, on the maritime dispute, where the arbitration went against India, India decided to go ahead and adopt it despite it not being in India's favor, but that verdict was in Bangladesh's favor, and India decided to honor it, signaling that it remains committed to a certain kind of a rule of law in the region, and it remains committed to robust India-Bangladesh ties. And I think that understanding is critical. That understanding is coming into the relationship, and hopefully it will take us away from some of the more contentious issues, some of the more contentious constituencies that are there in both countries, that would, that could potentially derail this momentum. But I think at the moment they look very robust.
So at the moment, it looks very robust, and all those hindrances can be overlooked, and also the challenges to the relationship as far as the Rohingya issue is concerned, or the China factor. But let's look at the other neighbor, Sri Lanka, and India's abstention from voting on Sri Lanka resolution at UNHRC has generated a very mixed response, Harsh. It is also looked at, in a way, some commentators have said that it is a betrayal of the Tamil sentiment. Some of them have seen it as a very strategic move. On the other hand, so India was under pressure from political parties here in Tamil Nadu to support the resolution, but voting in favor would have probably upset the balance of relationship. Also, looking at the fact that a lot of countries like Russia, China, even Bangladesh voted against or rejected the resolution. So now this was the 8th resolution on Sri Lanka since the end of the Tamil War. And if you look at India's record on voting on this issue, that has also shown, the ups and downs of New Delhi-Colombo relationship. So, can we understand how does this abstention, if you look at this is from that context?
Abstention has been a tool that India has often used in this particular case of Sri Lanka, because the challenge has always been that India wants to have a warm relationship with the government in Sri Lanka, and the way India has approached this issue is to say, well, the twin pillars of India's Sri Lanka policy, that India would like to see, a secure Sri Lanka with its territorial integrity intact, as well as we would also like to see the Tamil issue resolved peacefully, amicably, and of course the pressure on 13th Amendment to be built into the process. So while the Tamil aspirations issue, India has been taking it forward, I think the question here was how far and how do you convey to your Sri Lankan interlocutors that this is important, that India is not actually going on multilateral platforms and betraying a bilateral relationship, because that way that could have been perceived in Colombo. And this is particularly true now because you have the Rajapaksa government in office, which has been in the past very, very close to the Chinese. And now, in fact, since they have come to office over the last 1 year or so, we have seen how India has been navigating this very, very carefully. And Rajapaksas themselves, both the brothers, the Prime Minister and the President, have been also willing to engage India and take India alongside. They have made public comments about how they see India being a very important partner, that on national security, India is a preferred choice, and therefore they would not like to make it a zero-sum game between India and China. So for India, the question is, how do you keep that momentum going? How do you preserve your geostrategic interest in Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka, a very pivotal actor in the Indian Ocean region, geographically very important, strategically very important, and therefore not to make it to the Sri Lankan government, to signal to Sri Lankan government that India would be, despite having concerns, India would be siding with countries of the West, which would like to see a more sanctions-driven approach to the Sri Lankan question. So I think India has made it, with this vote, India has made it apparent that it's a difficult balancing act, but a balancing act that India is willing to continue for some time, till such time as the fundamentals of the relationship are not repaired, till such time as the Tamil question is not, it has been examined. It just so happens that this vote came during the Tamil Nadu elections, and therefore it also generated perhaps more heat than it would have had if there were no elections in Tamil Nadu. But I think that this is a tool that India has used for some time now when it comes to Sri Lanka, and my sense is that this is also going to continue for a while, because we don't really know the state of affairs, both in terms of how the Rajapaksa government in Sri Lanka is going to handle eventually the Tamil question. And there are some disturbing trends emerging, but those trends have also been pushed back by India, that this idea that India needs to be engaged in the process. If you if you go down the sanctions route, or if you go down the route of berating the Sri Lankan government on multilateral fora, then I think you lose that window that you have with the Sri Lankans, that you lose that engagement that you have with the Sri Lankan government, and that perhaps is not in India's interest. So I think India wants to keep the channels of communication open. India also wants to make it clear to the world that yes, while it believes that the Tamil question has to be dealt with, within the constitutional framework of Sri Lanka, it is not willing to go down the route of other states that would want a more coercive approach to Sri Lankan government.
Okay, but talking of the sanctions approach, Harsh, what's your analysis of the sanctions route that the Western countries have taken against China in Xinjiang? The Chinese atrocities have been going on there for a long time, and now we see that the Western countries, along with European Union, US, UK, Canada, they've all joined together and imposed new sanctions on China, and China has hit back, saying it's a serious mistake. China has also imposed reverse sanctions. We also know that China is EU's largest trading partner. So what impact will it have on China's human rights violations in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs? There have been UN reports that are more than 1 million Uyghur population who've been sent to those camps, which are called vocational training centers. It's the first time that we're seeing these sanctions by a group of countries. And China, of course, is very, very angered by this.
Yes, and I think if we look at the discourse at during between the Biden administration and the Chinese officials in Alaska, the first meeting that they had, and if you look at these sanctions and counter sanctions being imposed by China, there is a sense, I think, that the Chinese are making to the West in particular, that they would that they are not averse from approaching this through a tit for tat lens. That if you impose sanctions on China, China would do similar things to you, and it would have costs. I think one of the interesting things have been that Chinese have said that it will have an impact on the investment treaty that the European Union has signed just late last year with China. So clearly, the Chinese are they continue to use their economic ties for geopolitical purposes, and they are making it very clear that they would retaliate, and they are signaling to Europeans in particular, I think, which they feel is the Achilles heel in the Western sort of coalition, because there they feel the European Union is vulnerable, that they need economic support, and in China is the best possible country to do that, and therefore they are targeting European Union in particular. So what I think the West is now trying to do is to approach it through a unified lens, that we are all together in this, that all the Western countries together will take a position. I don't think it will have any impact on Chinese policies on the ground. Mm-hmm. Clearly, they have no intention of moderating their policies, because it's a part of their long-standing approach of how they have dealt with ethnic minorities. First in Tibet, then in Xinjiang, with the idea is to basically change the demography, change the way people approach their cultures and their religions, and make a more homogeneous society of what from their perspective, which will be useful as China moves forward. So I don't think Chinese Communist Party is going to change its strategy and tactic. What I think it is signaling is a rather sharp deterioration in in the Western Chinese relations, and which will have grave consequences, because I think that means that on a number of issues on which perhaps many in China and many in the West and many in the rest of the world were thinking that post-Trump we would see some kind of a change in tone, some kind of change in tenor, some kind of substantive shift as well in the way that two major power blocs engage with each other. I don't think that's happening. I think we are looking at a serious situation now, where threats, counter threats, sanctions, counter sanctions seem to be becoming the dominant phase of the discourse. They seem to be dominating the discourse at the moment. So it's very unlikely that anything might change from the Chinese side. What it will do is to accentuate this shift towards what many people think perhaps is going to be a new phase in the Western China relationship, perhaps a new Cold War, who knows?
Perhaps a new Cold War, deterioration in the relationship. And we also saw public display of a spat between the two. And Probably the sanctions approach may not work here. But a very quick comment before we end on the Israeli election that has again resulted in a stalemate, and it signals a political crisis there. This is actually in 2 years the fourth election, and it resulted in a stalemate. So a political crisis definitely, and a setback for Netanyahu.
Yes, it seems very very interesting because we may end up we may end up discussing a fifth election in 2 years very soon, because if the way things are progressing, it doesn't seem that there'll be a long lasting solution to the problem. And the way it is structured, that while Netanyahu has lost ground, the others have gained ground, but the others are not in a position also to cobble together a majority given the differences that they have. And similarly, on the case of Netanyahu, he has lost ground. He can reach out to right wing parties, but again, it's not entirely evident that those who would be sympathetic to Netanyahu's worldview would be willing to give him that kind of a majority. So I think it's likely to be a stalemate for some time. But it also demonstrates, I think, that Israeli democracy, Israeli institutional fabric perhaps needs some kind of a rethink, where one is looking at this institutional decay almost happening. And the challenge for Mr. Netanyahu would be how does he, at least in the interim, what does he do? Because he clearly is under enormous pressure, both when you look at his, the cases that are going on in the judiciary against him, as well as the pressure on him in terms of public profile. So I think for Netanyahu, the challenges are huge, but for Israeli democracy, the challenges are even bigger.
All right. So this is all that we have time for this week, Harsh, on this episode. But before we close, we would just like to tell our viewers that we would invite questions and like to take a few questions that you send in. A lot of our viewers watch our shows and send their responses. So every week we will probably take one question. And Harsh, I would request you to answer. Shad Hassan asks how India can balance between SCO and Quad. Do you want to take that one? How can there be a balance? We don't have much time, but if you can just quickly take one question.
Well, I think India's position over the last few years has been about issue-based coalitions. So I think in Quad, one can look at Quad primarily as a response to the geopolitical realities in the Indo-Pacific, whereas SCO has a different remit. SCO is aimed at Central Asia. SCO is aimed at managing stability and managing extremism emanating from Central Asia. So I think SCO's remit is very different. They are two different geographies. In fact, SCO is now, and this is an interesting point, SCO is likely to shape greater Eurasian geography, whereas Quad is primarily for the Indo-Pacific maritime geography. I think there is going to be a great degree of contestation going forward, but at the moment, I think we are looking at these two organizations or these two platforms doing different things for India. And if India is looking at them through different lenses, I think there is no need for India to choose at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Harsh. So every week we will take one question. Do send in your questions and your views. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Harsh.